Mia stood in front of the smashed window. Glass littered the front step of her small rental home. She had just returned from a second shift at the diner. Her 7-year-old daughter, Ruby, clung to her side, trembling. Painted on the wall, in large red letters, was a hateful slur. The words burned into Mia's mind. She wanted to drop to her knees and cry, but she had to remain strong. She put a hand over Ruby's eyes so the little girl would not see the cruel message. Neighbors across the street peeked from behind their curtains. Some pointed. No one spoke up. No one dared to take a stand. The night was dark, and the single streetlight flickered on and off. Mia reached into her bag for her phone. Her hand shook. She had felt racism before. She had heard the nasty comments at the grocery store, endured the questioning stares when she walked Ruby to school, and sensed the silent disapproval whenever she applied for a job. But this was the first time someone had come to her home with hate in their heart, leaving a message that screamed, "You do not belong here." Mia wanted to gather all the broken pieces of glass and fling them back at whoever had done this. Yet, she only pulled her daughter close. She whispered, "We're going to be okay," knowing that her voice shook with fear. Behind her, the wind howled. The door creaked. The lock was broken from the force of a small rock that had been thrown through the window. There was no sign of the culprit, only the ugly letters on the wall. Mia inhaled deeply, wiping away tears before they could fully form. She needed a plan. She needed to protect Ruby. She looked at her little girl's wide eyes and forced a tiny smile. "Let's go inside," Mia said softly. They stepped over shards of glass, careful not to cut their feet. Inside, the place felt cold, as if the hateful words outside had seeped through every wall. Mia flicked the light switch. The lamp overhead buzzed. The living room was a mess. A framed photo of Mia and Ruby had been knocked to the floor. A corner of the couch cushion was ripped. Who would break in just to cause destruction? All her life, Mia had fought for acceptance. She had grown up in a rough part of town. She knew how hateful people could be, but she had also seen kindness in strangers. Now, as she stood in her own living room surrounded by chaos, she realized that it took only one night to remind her how real racism was in her world. She took a shaky breath and picked up the shattered photo frame. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her daughter. "I'm so sorry." Ruby pressed her face against Mia's side, hiding from the sight of the broken home. Mia squeezed her eyes shut. She hated how helpless she felt. She was a single mother with barely enough money to fix a window, let alone move to a safer part of the city. Yet, she would do anything to protect Ruby. If that meant she had to fight every hateful person on her street, she would. For a second, Mia pictured a safer place. She pictured a happy house with a yard, maybe some flowers, and friendly neighbors who waved in greeting. But that dream felt far away. She called the police on her phone. She waited for someone to pick up, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. When the operator finally answered, Mia gave a shaky explanation. She heard them ask if there was an emergency. Mia glanced at the hateful slur on the outside wall. She said yes, her voice tight. And all the while, Ruby's small hand tugged at Mia's shirt, and Mia wondered how she would protect her child from a world that seemed full of cruelty. Earlier that morning, Mia woke up before the sun rose. She had to prepare Ruby's breakfast, pack her lunch, and get ready for work at the diner. She lived in a cramped 2-room apartment that barely had enough space for their belongings. The walls were a dull beige color, and the carpet smelled musty. But it was a roof over their heads, and that was something. Mia was 28. She had been on her own since she was 18, when her parents kicked her out for reasons she never fully understood. She had dreamed of going to college but never had the money to do so. Instead, she took whatever job was available. Now, she was a waitress, working to keep food on the table for Ruby. In a few hours, she would have to drop Ruby at school. Ruby was so bright and eager to learn. Mia wanted to give her child a better future, free from the hateful words Mia had heard growing up. With quick, practiced hands, Mia made toast and scrambled eggs. Ruby ate with her big brown eyes still half closed from sleep. She was used to these early mornings. Her thick, curly hair was in a small ponytail. She gave Mia a sleepy smile, and Mia found her worries fading for a moment. "Mama," Ruby said with a quiet voice, "can we go to the park after school?" Mia almost said yes. She knew how much Ruby loved the swings, but Mia also knew that she had an evening shift at the diner. She sighed. "I have to work another shift tonight," she explained gently. "We can't go today. Maybe on the weekend." Ruby's face fell for a moment, but she nodded bravely. She understood her mother's struggle more than any child her age should have to. Mia smiled and ruffled Ruby's hair. Promise we'll find time, okay? She said, trying to add a spark of hope. After dropping Ruby off at school, Mia took the bus to the diner. She stood most of the ride because the seats were full. She tried to ignore the stares. People often looked at her as if she did not belong. She forced herself to remain calm, hugging her small handbag close to her chest, reminding herself that she had to be strong. At the diner, she tied an apron around her waist. Her boss, Mr. Graham, was a strict man with a loud voice. He often barked orders at Mia, but she never complained. She needed this job. She spent the next several hours balancing plates on her arms, taking orders, cleaning up spills, and listening to customers chat about their lives. Some gave her warm smiles. Others acted as if she was invisible. She was used to it. By the end of her shift, her feet ached. She grabbed a quick sandwich, then rushed to pick up Ruby from school. After that, she would drop Ruby off at a neighbor's place so she could return to work the evening shift. It was a cycle that seemed endless, with little time to rest. Yet, Mia did not complain, because the only thing that mattered was keeping Ruby safe and healthy. On her way to pick Ruby up one day, Mia spotted an old woman standing by a heavy gate near a small park. The woman looked lost and frightened. Mia hesitated. She did not have much time, but she could not ignore someone who seemed in trouble. The old woman wore a thin coat. She had white hair tucked under a worn hat. Her eyes darted from left to right. She was trying to open the gate with trembling hands. Mia looked at her watch. She was already late, but something in her heart told her she should help. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Mia asked softly. The old woman turned. Her eyes were watery. "I can't open this gate," she said, her voice shaky. "My hands, they aren't as strong as they used to be, and I live just on the other side. I was trying to get home." Mia recognized the gate. It led to a small path that connected the park to a row of older homes. Many elderly people lived there. Mia gave the gate a firm push, and it squeaked open. "Thank you, dear," the woman said. Then she paused, giving Mia a long look. "I have seen you before, haven't I? You pass by here sometimes?" Mia nodded. "Yes, I drop my daughter off at the school nearby." The old woman gave a kind, if somewhat uncertain, smile. "I'm Mrs. Cole," she said. She took a step and stumbled a bit. Without thinking, Mia reached out to steady her. "Are you sure you'll be okay walking home alone?" Mia asked, worried. "You seem like you might need a hand." Mrs. Cole looked at Mia's worried face. "I'm a bit dizzy," she admitted, looking embarrassed. "But I don't want to bother you. You have places to be." Mia shook her head. "I'd like to help. It's no bother, I promise." Mrs. Cole let Mia guide her through the gate and down the small path. The houses were old but neat, each with a small garden. Mrs. Cole pointed to the second home on the left. Mia helped her up the front steps. The door was locked, and Mrs. Cole's hands shook so badly that she could not fit the key into the lock. Mia gently took the key and opened the door. Inside, the house smelled of old books and fresh flowers. A small table by the entrance held a photograph of a younger Mrs. Cole and a man who seemed to be her husband. Mia glanced around. The place was tidy, but it felt lonely. "Would you like me to fetch you some water?" Mia asked. Mrs. Cole nodded. She guided Mia to the kitchen. While Mia got a glass of water, Mrs. Cole sat at a small round table. She sipped slowly, her eyes never leaving Mia. "Thank you so much," Mrs. Cole said again, gratitude shining in her voice. "You know, people don't always stop to help. It means a lot that you did." Mia felt a rush of warmth at her words, but she was also anxious about the time. "I'm really glad to help, but I need to go soon to pick up my daughter." Mrs. Cole nodded in understanding. "Of course, dear. Please, let me give you something for your kindness." Mia hurriedly shook her head. "No, it's all right. I just wanted to make sure you got home safely." Mrs. Cole looked like she might insist, but a small wave of dizziness hit her. She swayed in her chair. Mia placed a hand on her shoulder. She felt concerned, but also torn. Ruby would be waiting. She could not be too late. Mrs. Cole recovered after a minute. She thanked Mia again. Relieved that the older woman seemed stable, Mia said goodbye and rushed out. She caught the bus just in time to get to the school. All the while, she thought about Mrs. Cole's gentle smile and frail body. Something about the old woman made Mia both sad and curious. But Mia had too many worries of her own to dwell on it for long. That evening, Mia was back at the diner. She tried to focus on her job, but images of Mrs. Cole kept popping into her mind. She found herself wondering if the old woman had someone to care for her. Meanwhile, customers came and went. Some left decent tips, Others grumbled over small mistakes. Mia's manager frowned at her, noticing her distraction. Later, as she headed home, Mia felt uneasy. The streetlights were dim, and she could sense the tension in the air. She had heard about a racist group that had made trouble in the area. They sometimes vandalized property or harassed people who did not look like them. Mia quickened her pace, determined to reach her apartment building safely. When she arrived, she found Ruby with the neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who often looked after her. Mrs. Alvarez was a kind older woman who spoke with a soft accent. Ruby was fast asleep on the couch. Mia thanked Mrs. Alvarez and carried her daughter home. She felt relief to find everything in order. She did not know that in a few days everything would change. The next morning, Mia repeated her usual routine. Ruby went to school, Mia worked the morning shift. In the afternoon, Mia had a rare break. She decided to check on Mrs. Cole. She remembered the old woman's shaky hands and the lonely look in her eyes. So, after dropping Ruby at a friend's birthday party, Mia walked back to that small neighborhood. When Mia reached Mrs. Cole's home, she noticed that the curtains were drawn. A neighbor waved at her and commented that Mrs. Cole had not been out much lately. Mia knocked on the door, hoping the older woman was okay. There was a long silence before the door finally creaked open. Mrs. Cole stood there, looking frailer than before, her face pale. "Oh, Mia," she said in a weak voice. "It's you. Come in." Mia entered the dim hallway. She asked Mrs. Cole how she was feeling. The old woman sighed, moving slowly toward her small living room, which had an old-fashioned couch and a rocking chair. "I've been having dizzy spells," Mrs. Cole admitted. "My son, who lives far away, wants me to move into a home, but I don't want to leave my house." Mia sat with her on the couch. She felt a pang of sympathy. Mrs. Cole explained that she had lived in this house for over 50 years. She and her husband had bought it after their wedding, and they had raised their children here. Over time, her husband passed and her children moved away. She was alone now, but she was attached to every corner of this place. "I'm worried, though," Mrs. Cole went on. "Sometimes I can't manage simple tasks like opening jars or carrying groceries, and I get frightened walking alone." Mia reached out and patted the old woman's hand. "If you ever need help, please let me know," she said. "I don't have much time, but if there's something I can do, I'll try." Mrs. Cole looked at her with deep gratitude. She began to talk about her life, how she grew up in the South during a time of open segregation and hatred. She spoke softly, recalling painful memories of racism in her youth. Mia listened, feeling a kinship, because she also knew what it felt like to be judged by the color of her skin. In the weeks that followed, Mia made it a habit to visit Mrs. Cole whenever she could spare a moment. She would help with small tasks, getting groceries, tidying the living room, or just sitting with the old woman and listening to her stories. Ruby sometimes came along, brightening the old house with her laughter. Mrs. Cole's eyes would light up when she saw the little girl. She would offer Ruby homemade cookies, telling her about the flowers in the small backyard garden. During one visit, Mrs. Cole shared a memory that made Mia pause. She talked about a time when she was a teenager and saw her father chase off a family that tried to move onto their street. Her father had been angry that the family was of a different race. Mrs. Cole admitted that, back then, she did not fully understand the hatred, but she learned to question it over time. She felt guilt for all the time she had stayed silent. Mia felt a lump in her throat. She knew racism came in many forms. Some people screamed hateful slurs. Others stood by and did nothing. Though Mrs. Cole did not seem racist herself, the story reminded Mia of how deep those wounds ran in society. As Mia grew closer to Mrs. Cole, she started opening up about her own life. She spoke of how she had become pregnant with Ruby at 19 and the father had vanished. She explained that her own parents disapproved and they had never gotten along with Mia's boyfriend at the time. Mia was left to fend for herself. She worked long hours, faced stares and assumptions, and tried to stay hopeful for her daughter's sake. Mrs. Cole listened, her eyes glistening with sympathy. She took Mia's hand. "You're stronger than you know," she whispered. "I see it in how you care for Ruby. Don't let anyone take that light from you." Mia blinked back tears, touched by the older woman's words. For so long she had felt alone. Now she found comfort in an unlikely friend. Despite this new friendship, life continued to deal harsh blows. Mia's landlord raised the rent without warning, and she had trouble making the payment on time. She also noticed more rude remarks at the diner. A new regular customer sneered at her every chance he got. using thinly veiled racial insults. Mia did her best to stay calm and polite, but it wore her down. She needed the job too much to walk away. At night, Mia would sit in her small apartment, watching Ruby sleep, and wonder if this was all life had to offer. She wanted better for her child. A real home, a chance at education, the freedom to walk down the street without fear. Sometimes, when despair crept in, Mia would recall Mrs. Cole's gentle voice. "Don't let anyone take your light." She tried to hold onto that hope. One day, as Mia was on her way to pick Ruby up, she saw a group of teenagers making fun of Mrs. Cole near the park. Mrs. Cole was trying to walk back home with groceries, and her cart had gotten stuck. The teenagers laughed and called her offensive names. They mimicked her shaky steps. Mia's heart pounded. She ran over, yelling at them to stop. Her voice trembled with anger. She stood between them and Mrs. Cole, her arms spread out. The teens hurled a few more insults, some aimed at Mia's race. Then they ran off, snickering. Mia helped Mrs. Cole free the cart. The older woman was shaken. Tears shone in her eyes. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Mrs. Cole whispered. "Some days I think we haven't moved forward at all." "It's not your fault," Mia said. She realized her hands were balled into fists. Racism didn't only target people of color. Sometimes it latched onto anyone who seemed different or vulnerable. She hated it. Mia took the groceries and walked Mrs. Cole home. She was late picking Ruby up, but did not care. Mrs. Cole needed her. At the door, Mrs. Cole placed a hand on Mia's arm. Her lips trembled. "I want to thank you for defending me," Mrs. Cole said. "You don't know what it means to me. I wish I could do something to help you in return." Mia brushed it off. She didn't see it as a debt. She just could not bear to watch someone she cared about be bullied. That night, Mia came home from her evening shift to find the scene from the beginning of this story. The smashed window, the hateful slur scrawled across her wall in red paint, the cold wind whistling through broken glass. Her stomach churned. The words were aimed at her race, spelling out a message of pure hatred. Ruby was with her, and Mia quickly shielded the little girl from the worst of it. They tiptoed around the shards of glass, uncertain if the vandal was still lurking in the shadows. Mia called the police, who arrived late and offered little comfort. An officer took down her statement. He asked if Mia had any enemies, or if she had done anything to provoke such an attack. Mia felt a surge of anger. She felt like the officer was blaming her. She tried to remain calm and told him she had no idea who would do this. When the police left, Mia and Ruby were alone again. The apartment no longer felt safe. Mia spent the rest of the night cleaning up the broken glass. She used paper towels and soap to scrub the hateful word off the wall, tears streaming down her face. The next day, she took Ruby to Mrs. Cole's house. She did not know where else to go. She could not afford to move, and she did not want to stay in a place that felt so hostile. Mrs. Cole opened her door and immediately saw the fear in Mia's eyes. She hugged both Mia and Ruby, inviting them in. Over tea, Mia explained what had happened. Mrs. Cole's face grew pale, and her hands shook with anger. "This is terrible," she murmured. "Are you safe? Is Ruby safe?" Mia shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "I don't know. I'm scared. I can't keep living like this, but I have no choice." Mrs. Cole closed her eyes for a moment, as if wrestling with her own thoughts. Then she spoke slowly. "Mia, there's something I need to tell you. But not yet. I need a little more time." Mia was confused. "Tell me what?" she asked gently. Mrs. Cole shook her head. "Please, let me think on it a bit longer." Mia nodded, though her mind spun with questions. She sensed that Mrs. Cole's secret had something to do with her own past, but she had no idea how it could change her life. All she knew was that her new friend's support was a small ray of light in a dark time. In the days that followed, Mia struggled to keep her spirits up. She covered the broken window with a plastic sheet. The landlord refused to fix it right away. He claimed it was Mia's fault for inviting trouble. Meanwhile, the hateful word left faint marks on the wall, no matter how much Mia scrubbed. Ruby refused to sleep alone, too frightened by any noise outside. Mia tried to comfort her child by telling bedtime stories about brave heroes and kind people, but the real world seemed full of cruel bullies and closed doors. At the diner, Mia noticed a change in some customers. Word had spread about the vandalism. A few folks gave her sympathetic looks. Others avoided her eyes, as if she carried a contagious disease. Mr. Graham told her that the diner could not afford any trouble and warned her not to bring drama to work. Mia bit her lip and said nothing. She confided in Mrs. Cole about the rising sense of dread in her heart. She felt stuck, with nowhere to turn. Mrs. Cole listened, tears forming in her wise old eyes. She kept hinting that she knew something important but never revealed it outright. Each day, Mia grew more curious, but she respected Mrs. Cole's wish for time. One afternoon, Mia decided to take Ruby to the park to lift their moods. She invited Mrs. Cole to join them, thinking the older woman might like some fresh air. The day was bright, and the park was full of children playing. Ruby squealed with delight on the swings. Mia and Mrs. Cole sat on a nearby bench watching the little girl soar back and forth. Mrs. Cole cleared her throat. "Mia, have you ever wondered about your mother or father? You said they kicked you out, but do you know why?" Mia frowned. The question felt like a stab in an old wound. They said I was making bad choices. They didn't like Ruby's father, but there was more to it, I think. My father always carried hidden prejudice. Maybe it was because Ruby's father was from a different race. I never fully understood. They just cut me out. Mrs. Cole stared at the children laughing in the distance. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said. "I wish parents could always embrace their children. It breaks my heart that they turned you away." They sat in silence for a moment. A gentle breeze blew through the trees. Mrs. Cole glanced at Mia, a thoughtful look on her face. "Mia, if there was a chance for you to make peace with your past, would you take it?" Mia shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. It's not just me anymore. I have Ruby to think about." Mrs. Cole's fingers twisted around each other. She seemed nervous, but she said nothing more. That same evening, as Mia prepared for her second shift, her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, knocked on her door. She looked uneasy. She told Mia she had overheard a few local troublemakers talking about running out the people who don't belong here. Mrs. Alvarez warned Mia to be careful. Mia's heart pounded. She could not afford to leave the neighborhood, but she had no idea what these men might do next. She thanked Mrs. Alvarez for the warning and locked her door, though the broken lock from before did little to soothe her fears. At the diner, Mia struggled to keep her mind on her work. She kept expecting someone to burst in and attack her. When her shift ended, she walked home with her pulse racing. Every shadow seemed threatening. But she reached the building safely, hurried upstairs, and locked herself inside. She passed the next few days in a fog of anxiety. Ruby sensed her mother's worry. She clung to Mia's hand whenever they were outside. It hurt Mia to see her child so frightened. Mrs. Cole was the only person Mia felt she could turn to. One afternoon, Mia visited the old woman and broke down in tears, confessing her fears. Mrs. Cole hugged her tightly. "I can't keep living like this," Mia wept. "I don't have the money to move. I don't have family to help me. What am I supposed to do?" Mrs. Cole's voice was calm. "There is something I need to show you," she said. "Give me a moment." Mia watched as Mrs. Cole left the room. A few minutes later, the old woman returned, holding a small wooden box. She sat down next to Mia and carefully opened it. Inside were old photographs, letters, and documents. Mrs. Cole's hands shook as she lifted a certain paper. She handed it to Mia. Mia studied the paper, eyes widening. It was a birth certificate. The name on it was unfamiliar, but the last name matched Mrs. Cole's maiden name. Below it was a legal document showing an adoption. The date was decades ago. Mia read through it slowly, her brain racing to make sense of it. Mrs. Cole took a deep breath. "My family has secrets, Mia. I haven't told many people. But I once gave up a child for adoption when I was very young. That child is related to you." Mia felt her heart skip. This was impossible. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. With tears in her eyes, Mrs. Cole explained. When she was 16, she got pregnant. Her family, strict and traditional, insisted the child be given up for adoption. She never saw the baby again, though she tried to search as the years passed. That baby grew up, had children of their own, and eventually one of those children was Mia's mother. "I've known for a little while now," Mrs. Cole confessed. "The day I first saw you, I recognized the shape of your eyes. You look so much like my lost daughter. I hired a private investigator out of curiosity, and he found the link. I was afraid to tell you. I worried you would hate me, or think I was meddling." Mia stared in shock. She tried to speak, but no words came out. If Mrs. Cole's story was correct, that meant, "Are you saying you're my great-grandmother?" Mrs. Cole nodded, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. "Yes, I am. I didn't know how to tell you. And I had no idea you were living so close until the day we met at the gate. It felt like fate." Mia's eyes welled with tears. Her mind raced back to the times she felt so alone, believing she had no family who cared about her. Now, here was this frail, kind old woman, revealing a secret that changed everything. Mia had a whirlwind of emotions. She felt shock, excitement, confusion, and even a bit of anger. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice shaking. Mrs. Cole's shoulders trembled. "I was scared you wouldn't believe me, or that you wouldn't want anything to do with me. I know how hard racism can be. I didn't want to bring you more stress. But now I see you're in danger, and I can't just sit by. I want to help." Mia looked down at the document in her hands, her vision blurred with tears. The signatures were old and faded, but they told a truth that was undeniable. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, a hint of belonging she had never felt before. She also felt the sting of being kept in the dark all this time. "How can you help?" Mia asked softly, wiping her tears. Mrs. Cole squared her shoulders with as much strength as her frail body could manage. "I have some savings. My late husband left me with a comfortable amount. I've been saving it for my children, but we've grown distant over the years. They have their own lives and we rarely speak. I want to use some of that money to help you, Mia. I want to help you find a safer place, or fix your current home, or whatever you need." Mia's pride bristled. She had never taken handouts. She knew how people judged her, assuming she was lazy or wanted charity. But Mrs. Cole was not just anyone. If what she said was true, she was family. And Mia was desperate. She thought about Ruby's scared face, the broken window, and the rent she could barely pay. Tears streamed down Mia's cheeks. She reached out and hugged Mrs. Cole, holding onto her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. I don't know what to say." Mrs. Cole patted Mia's back. "Just let me help." Over the next few days, Mia spent more time with Mrs. Cole, learning about the details of their family connection. She was still in awe that this elderly woman was a piece of her history. They discussed ways to use Mrs. Cole's funds to move Mia to a safer place, or at least reinforce the apartment against vandals. Mia felt both relief and guilt. She worried about what others would think if they found out she accepted money from a wealthy relative. But every time she thought of turning it down, she remembered the fear in Ruby's eyes. Meanwhile, rumors started to spread in the neighborhood. Some people saw Mia visiting Mrs. Cole's home and began to whisper that Mia was taking advantage of an old woman. Others muttered that Mrs. Cole was a traitor for helping someone of a different race. The hateful atmosphere thickened. One morning, Mia found a nasty note slipped under her door. It accused her of conning old ladies and told her to leave before it's too late. Mia's hands shook as she read it. She felt a surge of anger. She had done nothing wrong. Yet, people insisted on seeing the worst in her. When Mia showed the note to Mrs. Cole, the old woman's face darkened. "This isn't right," she said firmly. "I won't stand for it. Let's see about speeding up our plan." Mrs. Cole made some phone calls, setting appointments with a realtor to look at properties in a different part of town. She also arranged for a contractor to meet Mia at her apartment to assess the damage and possibly fix the window. Mia felt gratitude beyond words. She felt strange letting someone else take charge, but she realized she could not fight every battle alone. Things seemed to be looking up. Mia and Ruby began to envision a new start in a neighborhood with less hostility. Mia still worked long hours, but the idea of escaping the hateful messages gave her new energy. Even Ruby seemed happier, humming little tunes as she played with her dolls. Yet, a part of Mia worried about how the racism she faced would affect Ruby's self-esteem in the future. She decided to have a talk with her daughter, explaining that some people judged others by the color of their skin. She tried to do it gently, wanting Ruby to understand but not lose hope. Ruby listened with wide eyes. "I know, Mama," she said softly. "I see how people look at us sometimes." Mia fought back tears. She did not want Ruby to grow up thinking that was normal. She wanted to show her child there were people like Mrs. Cole who cared beyond old prejudices. Later that day, Mia accompanied Mrs. Cole to a doctor's appointment. Mrs. Cole insisted on walking in by herself, but Mia noticed how weak she seemed. In the waiting room, Mrs. Cole squeezed Mia's hand. "I want to see you and Ruby happy," Mrs. Cole said with a trembling voice. "That's all I want. I've made mistakes in my life, and I've stayed silent in the face of racism for too many years. Maybe helping you is my way of atoning for that." Mia's eyes welled up. She promised that she and Ruby would never forget Mrs. Cole's kindness. She had no idea how soon she would have to repay that kindness with courage she did not know she had. On a gray, rainy evening, just a week before Mia planned to move out of her apartment, someone knocked loudly on her door. Mia froze. It was late, and she was not expecting anyone. Ruby peered up from her coloring book, her eyes wide with fear. Mia approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" she called. "Open up," a gruff voice replied. "We want to talk." Alarm bells went off in Mia's mind. She recognized the voice. It belonged to one of the local troublemakers who sometimes loitered around the building. Mia's pulse pounded. She looked around for something to protect herself with. "Go away," Mia said, trying to keep her voice steady. Instead of leaving, the man banged on the door harder. "You need to leave this neighborhood," he growled. "We don't want you here. We don't need your kind messing with old ladies or bringing trouble to our streets." Ruby started to cry. Mia's hand shook. She quietly ushered Ruby into the bedroom and locked her inside. Then she grabbed her phone, ready to call the police. But she hesitated, remembering how little they had done before. She went to the door again. "I'm not opening this door," Mia said firmly. "If you don't leave, I'm calling the cops." The man laughed, a harsh sound. "Call them, but they won't help you for long. You're on borrowed time." Then, with a final kick to the door, he left. Mia sank to the floor, her heart racing. She realized her entire body was shaking. She could not keep living in fear. She had to protect Ruby. She had to stay strong. The next day, Mia told Mrs. Cole about the incident. Mrs. Cole's face grew tight with concern. She told Mia to come stay with her until the move was finalized. Mia gratefully agreed, packing a few things for Ruby and herself. She locked up the damaged apartment and left, not knowing if she would ever feel safe there again. Mrs. Cole's home became a refuge. She cleared out a spare bedroom for Mia and Ruby. The house was old-fashioned, with creaking floors, but it felt warm and safe compared to the tension Mia had felt in her apartment. Ruby, timid at first, soon grew comfortable, exploring the small garden out back and listening to Mrs. Cole's stories about the flowers. Mia found herself helping Mrs. Cole more and more. She cooked meals, cleaned around the house, and made sure the old woman took her medication. Their bond deepened. They had a family connection, but they were also close friends who understood each other's struggles. Still, beneath the surface, Mia felt uneasy. The hateful presence in the neighborhood had not just vanished. She worried about stepping outside. She feared that trouble would follow her to Mrs. Cole's doorstep. And then, her worst fear came true. One afternoon, when Mia was at the diner and Ruby was at school, someone tried to break into Mrs. Cole's house. Mrs. Cole had just enough time to call the police, but the intruder fled. There were no clear signs of theft, only scattered footprints outside the window and a threatening note similar to the one Mia had received. It said, "We told you to leave. Now the old lady pays too." Mrs. Cole trembled as she recounted the event to Mia that evening. She tried to put on a brave face, but Mia saw how shaken she was. Mia's anger flared. She was done being a victim. She decided to gather what evidence she could and file a strong complaint with the police, perhaps with the help of a local advocacy group. That night, as Mia tried to sleep, she heard Mrs. Cole moving around the house, restless. Mia got up to check on her. She found Mrs. Cole in the living room staring at a photograph of her late husband. "I'm so sorry, Mia," Mrs. Cole whispered, tears in her eyes. "I brought this on you by revealing who I am, by wanting to help you. I never thought it would cause more danger." Mia's throat tightened. "No, this isn't your fault," she said firmly. "Hateful people cause the danger, not us. We have every right to live without fear." Mrs. Cole nodded, wiping her tears. They sat together in silence for a long time. Despite the fear, a bond of love and understanding grew stronger than ever. Mia set the move date. She found a small rental home in a nicer part of the city. It was modest, but safer. Mrs. Cole planned to help with the first several months of rent. Mia felt a wave of hope, believing this new place might be the fresh start she needed. However, just 2 days before she was to move, the tension reached a boiling point. Mia, Ruby, and Mrs. Cole returned from the store one afternoon. As they approached Mrs. Cole's house, they saw a group of men gathered outside. Mia recognized the one who had threatened her. He stood in front, his arms folded, sneering. "You don't listen, do you?" he said, stepping forward. His friends snickered. Ruby clutched Mia's hand. Mrs. Cole looked terrified. Mia's heart pounded. She stood in front of them, shielding Ruby and Mrs. Cole. "Get out of our way," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. The man smirked. "I guess we have to make you listen," he sneered. "We don't want you here. You think you can take advantage of an old lady, huh? We see right through you." "That's not true," Mia said, her anger building. "Mrs. Cole is my family. I would never take advantage of her." The men laughed, exchanging mocking looks. One of them spat on the ground near Mia's feet. Family, yeah, right, he said. She's not even your color. You're lying. Mia felt her blood boil. She was about to speak when Mrs. Cole stepped forward. Her eyes shone with a steely resolve Mia had never seen before. She is my great-granddaughter, Mrs. Cole declared, her voice trembling but strong. I will not stand for this hateful behavior. Get off my property, or I will call the police right now. The men hesitated, surprised by her courage, but the leader stepped closer, towering over Mrs. Cole. You're old, lady. You better watch your mouth before something happens to you. At that moment, neighbors began poking their heads out. Some grabbed phones to record. Others shouted for the men to leave the old woman alone. Mia saw one of the men frown, realizing they were being watched. She mustered all her courage. You go near her again, and you'll regret it, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I'm done running. I'm done being scared. For a tense moment, it seemed like a fight might break out. Then sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had already called the police. The group scattered, cursing as they ran. Mia exhaled shakily, hugging Ruby and Mrs. Cole close. Though her hands trembled, she felt a rush of relief. They had stood up to fear. And this time, the neighborhood did not remain silent. A few days later, Mia, Ruby, and Mrs. Cole sat in the living room of Mia's new home. It was small and had only the bare essentials, but it was safe. The house was in a more diverse, accepting area. Mia had found a new diner job a few blocks away. Though the pay was similar, she already felt a difference in how people treated her. Mrs. Cole was helping unpack dishes. Ruby danced around, exploring the new place with excitement in her eyes. Mia watched them both, her heart brimming with gratitude. She thought back to the day she had helped a frail old woman open a gate. It had started as a simple act of kindness, and it led to the discovery that she was not alone in the world. She had a family member she never knew about, someone who believed in her worth even when society tried to tear her down. As they settled on the small couch, Mrs. Cole cleared her throat. I have one more surprise, she said, taking out a folded piece of paper from her purse. This is a scholarship fund my husband and I established years ago. We used to give it to students who faced hardships. It's not a huge amount, but if Ruby wants to go to a good school or you want to take classes yourself, this could help. I want you to have it. Mia's eyes filled with tears. She stared at the paper, realization dawning that her dreams for Ruby's education might actually come true. For so long, she had felt trapped by the day-to-day struggle to pay bills. Now, a door to the future stood open. She thanked Mrs. Cole, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know how to repay you, she whispered. Mrs. Cole smiled, patting Mia's hand. You already have. You gave me something I thought I'd lost long ago, a family connection, hope, and the chance to do what's right. Mia hugged the older woman, tears streaming down her face. She felt the weight of her old fears fall away, replaced by a sense of possibility she had never known before. Late that night, after Mrs. Cole had gone back to her own home, Mia sat in the new living room, staring at the moonlight that crept in through the window. Ruby was fast asleep in her new bedroom, dreaming of a brighter future. Mia let her mind wander over the events of the past few months. She thought about the hateful slurs, the broken window, and the threats. She shuddered at how close she had come to losing hope. Then she remembered Mrs. Cole's revelation. That single discovery that they were family had changed everything. Mia realized that the older woman had faced her own demons of racism and regret. By deciding to help Mia, Mrs. Cole was also healing old wounds in her own heart. Mia felt humbled that life had brought them together under such strange circumstances. As she gazed at the shadows on the walls, Mia allowed herself a small smile. She remembered the final confrontation with those men outside Mrs. Cole's house. How the neighbors had stepped up, how the phone recordings had captured their threats. The police were still investigating. Mia hoped those hateful individuals would be held accountable. In the quiet of that moment, Mia felt a sense of suspense linger. She knew that racism was not defeated in a single day. There might be new challenges ahead. But she also knew she had found strength in herself, in her daughter, and in the family bond she had discovered with Mrs. Cole. No matter what came next, they would face it together. Mia closed her eyes, picturing a brighter future for Ruby. Maybe Ruby would grow up to be a teacher, a doctor, or an artist. Whatever she chose, Mia would stand beside her, armed with the love and resilience that had carried them through so many trials. And in her heart, Mia carried the secret of Mrs. Cole's gift, a scholarship fund and a promise that someone in this world believed in her, believed in the power of their shared bloodline to stand against hate. She thought about the cruelty they had faced and realized it had not broken them. Instead, it had led Mia to a new understanding of family and heritage. She felt tears slip down her cheeks, But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief and hope. For the first time in a long while, Mia believed that she and her daughter would be okay. That night, Mia slept peacefully in the simple house, a place she could now call home. Outside, the city lights blinked in the distance, as if keeping watch. Somewhere in another part of town, Mrs. Cole also closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of having found her lost family. And though the world was not perfect and racism still lurked in the shadows, both women carried a spark of faith that love and kindness could stand against the darkest hate. A single act of help had unlocked a life-changing secret. That secret, now revealed, formed a bridge between a struggling single mom and an elderly woman who had once felt alone in the world. As Mia drifted into sleep, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, knowing that she and Mrs. Cole shared more than just a secret. They shared hope for a better tomorrow. And that hope, Mia thought, was stronger than any hateful word scrawled on a wall.